to start in a second. I'd just like to introduce Dr. Ruth Wandhöfer. Her bio, we could actually spend 10 minutes just going over her bio. It's quite illustrious. She's worked a number of senior posts. She's a non-executive director at Permanent TSB in Digital Identity and a partner at Gauss Ventures. She's also visiting professor at the London Institute of Banking and Finance, that's us, LIBF, and she also lectures at the Queen Mary London School of Law. Today she's going to be lecturing to us, and just to say congratulations, I see from Computer Weekly as one of the most influential women in tech. So another thing on your bio there, a fresh one there, Ruth. Congratulations. So over to you, and thanks so much for joining us, and I will see you later.
Excellent. Thank you, Alex. It's a great pleasure to have so many of you dialing in from all around the world, and fabulous to see also the composition of your different roles. So maybe just to give you a quick background, the Certificate in Principles of Payments is a course that we designed more than 3 years ago because we felt at LIBF that payments was starting to almost change the way banking operated. And so this course is really a course that is refreshed at a regular interval around every year and a half, because so much is happening in payments. I would say maybe around 10 years ago, a lot of what's happening in payments was regulation. Since then, we've seen an explosion of technology, new processes and business models. And of course, we know that regulation, certainly in Europe and some other jurisdictions, is still keeping us afoot and changing the environment as we go along. So this course shall be interesting for anyone who wants to understand more about payments processes, but also how to design new business models and what's possible out there as we see more and more non-bank payment providers entering the market in many jurisdictions, as well as the rise of open banking that certainly people in the UK are very familiar with, but it's also spreading around the world. So let me give you a brief overview of what we were looking at. This is literally a teaser of the course. There's no way to even give you a quarter of the course in an hour because it's so much interesting content. But the idea is basically to introduce you at a very high level as to how payment systems work, what different payment instruments we have. I'll be giving just a few examples to set the scene. I'll also look at payment regulation because this is a very important basis for how services are being provided, as well as a driver for new business models and solutions that are coming to the market. And I will also look at payment system innovation in terms of some of the key infrastructure changes that we're starting to see in the market coming up. So let me start at the very beginning. Obviously, everyone needs payments. We are all very familiar with payments in our daily context. One thing that certainly the COVID crisis has shown is that cash payments are no longer in fashion. In many countries, no longer accepted as a means of payments in shops because of the infection risk. And therefore, electronic payments are becoming more and more important in the retail consumer-facing context. But of course, if we look at the very broader picture around how trade operates, and that's certainly Alex's piece of specialization, buyers and sellers around the world that are trading with each other need to be able to pay each other. And there we have, of course, the enhanced difficulty around foreign exchange. So we need to make sure that the payment arrives in the right currency. Sometimes the currency conversion happens in the country of the sender, and sometimes it happens in the country of the receiver. And sometimes payments are just made in US dollar, which is still seen as the global trade currency, even though many fractions around the world are contesting this and experimenting with different ideas, from central bank digital currency down to currency baskets, in order to give maybe a counterweight to that. If we look at the very sort of high-level framework of payments, I put up a slide which usually has some errors, but it doesn't really matter that they're not there at this point, that shows you the sort of four-corner model of payments. And this is something that is very clearly also picked up by regulatory frameworks that are providing conduct of business and operational rules for payments, such as the Payment Services Directive in Europe. So in a payment, we have the payer and the payee, obviously. That can be a consumer or a business or even a government. And we have the payers, PSP, or payment service provider, a term that has been introduced more than 10 years ago to actually designate those entities providing payments, which could be more than banks. In the past, many people were familiar with banks providing payments, but now we actually see a lot more non-banks or e-money institutions, depending on the regulatory context, providing payments. So it could be various type of providers here. And again, on the receiver side, the payee or beneficiary of a transaction has a beneficiary provider, payee's PSP, which can be a bank, but it can be also another type of payment service provider institution. Now, the relationships between the payer and his provider, as well as the payee and his provider, tend to be governed in a framework contract where people, sign terms and conditions, open an account, and get a number of services provided from that provider. Over the years, we've seen a lot of conduct of business regulation in many jurisdictions that define how this information and how this contract should be looking like, and what is the information that you have to provide as a minimum requirement to a customer. The rules between the paying and the payers and payee payment service providers are governed usually by a scheme and an infrastructure. So I put up here scheme rules and PEACH or CSM, which is really the example in the European context, the Pan-European Automated Clearinghouse or Clearing and Settlement Mechanism. We will go into that in more detail in a second. So we have a sort of infrastructure as well as rules around that infrastructure that are business rules, operational rules, and technical rules, which allow the sending and receiving institutions to communicate with each other and exchange funds. And I think one thing that is quite important to understand at the very beginning of anyone's payments journey is that usually money doesn't move. So even though we're saying Bank A is sending money to Bank B, what tends to happen is either they have book entries or they have entries via a clearing and settlement mechanism, which is changing the balances between the institutions in terms of who holds what money, but we don't have any physical movement of funds. Those days where people are shipping gold from A to B are definitely over, and that is quite important to understand when we look at different examples of payments. Of course, the sending and receiving customer have a commercial relationship, or it could be just you paying your aunt some money or your aunt paying you some money. So this is a sort of high-level framework, and we will see some examples as to where certain sets of rules and information sits. Now, I mentioned already just now the clearing and settlement mechanism, which is something that binds all the banks and payment providers together. It depends really on the country as to whether more than banks are eligible to join a clearing and settlement mechanism. Certainly in the UK, we have e-money institutions as well as sometimes payment institutions, which are much lighter regulated than credit institutions that can join such a clearing and settlement mechanism. But first of all, what is this sort of CSM here? It is an ability for banks to reach each other in terms of information so that Bank A can truly send money to Bank B. So it's a sort of hub in the middle. And it's something that, of course, end users don't see. So we don't really see as customers, whether we're businesses or consumers, how the banks communicate with each other in terms of managing their balances as to whether dollar moved one side, yen moved to the other side. But a clearing and settlement mechanism is something that basically enables that. So clearing, just to be even more precise, means we're recording the transactions between two financial institutions, or in broader context, payment service providers. And settlement is the transfer of value from one account to the other. Now, if we think about the sort of clearing and settlement mechanisms at the central bank, which are so-called real-time RTGS gross settlement systems, we actually have a situation where we're often looking primarily at banks. These banks hold their accounts in terms of their reserve accounts at the central bank, and any obligations that are exchanged between those banks, for example, if Barclays sends money to HSBC in the UK via the central bank system, then this information would be registered in the central bank accounts, and there would be settlement across individual banks' accounts held at the central bank, and that is the true settlement process. So it's very important that a lot of things are possible in clearing, which is about recording transactions in terms of ledger entries, credit and debit balances, that can happen at a sort of commercial bank level. But when we talk about true settlement and settlement finality, we actually only speak about central bank money, and we speak about legislated systems that are basically financial market infrastructures that are subject to a specific regulatory regime, which in Europe is called the Settlement Finality Directive. So settlement is a bit harder than clearing, but settlement tends to happen, for example, if we look at retail payments, you can have a lot of retail payments throughout the day, but maybe these only settle only once or twice a day at the central bank. And that is an example I will give later, for example, in the context of faster payments in the UK. So which types of payments exist? Obviously, we have loads of types of payments, but I'm going into the three main categories, and three because here we sit in Europe, so there's a specific European example involved here. First of all, we have, of course, international payments, which I mentioned at the beginning can often involve currency conversions unless people are happy just to be paid in dollars and people have a lot of dollars, or there's trade between the US and other dollar receiving countries. These international payments mostly tend to be transacted via the SWIFT network, which is a global bank-owned messaging network that allows for the communication between the different banks in terms of managing debit and credit entries into the bank's different accounts that they hold with each other. So there's a whole network around bank relationships involved there. We have in Europe quite a specific model in terms of the euro transactions that have been processing since 2007 and 2009, which are so-called SEPA payments, or single euro area payments. This is a specific geographical zone that consists of all the euro countries plus additional countries, such non-euro countries, including today the UK, as well as some of the overseas territories of European member state countries. And it really is a set of scheme rules that have been defined for transacting credit transfers and direct debits in euro between banks in that jurisdictional hub, so in all of those countries together. So it is not an infrastructure, which is the sort of clearing and settlement mechanism or system at the central bank that I mentioned earlier. It is a sort of rule book where all the banks that want to offer services in this area are following, and then different types of infrastructures, which could be domestic or pan-European, are processing the transaction. And this is really about euro transactions in that broader geographical zone. We also, of course, in every country have domestic payments, and these in many countries are today transacted also via technical electronic systems. So it's not about cash payments, it's about local automated clearinghouses transactions. And as maybe some of you may be aware, we've seen a number of real-time retail payment systems coming up in many countries, starting with faster payments ages ago in 2009, I believe, and then being sort of copied by many other countries. So we have a lot of different versions of domestic payment systems that allow for different functionalities. Even a card clearing system or a check imaging system would be falling under that category. So just to give you sort of a slightly more closer to home example in terms of the UK, I mentioned just now faster payments. Again, it's a payment clearing system, which is hooking up all the banks as well as eligible non-banks in the UK. This particular system operates on a deferred net settlement basis, which means that not every transaction is settled on a gross basis, and therefore you can almost achieve real-time payments between user accounts. So for any user, whether it's a consumer or a business in the UK, initiating a faster payment means that the receiving party will receive it a few seconds later. It's almost instant. This system, as I mentioned at the beginning, is a system that operates on the basis of exchanging messages between the banks, which basically show the obligation that moves from one bank to another as a transaction goes. So suddenly Bank A owes Bank B money, or maybe Bank B owes Bank A money over the day. And these transactions can then be bundled up in terms of netting them off so that they can be ultimately settled. If Bank A owes more money to Bank B between, at 11 o'clock, at 3 o'clock, or at 5 o'clock, then there would be actual settlement at the central bank accounts that these banks hold with the Bank of England. In the case of faster payments, this happens 3 times a day. I mentioned SEPA as a second example of a payment instrument or scheme, really. So it's a sort of set of rules that binds people together. SEPA was an interesting example because it was designed by the whole market together. Normally, a payment system is designed at a domestic level and run either by the government or by a commercial entity that is quite close reporting to the government, such as is the case with faster payments. SEPA decided to split the technical infrastructure from the rulebook. And so SEPA really only is a rulebook, and technical infrastructures that follow those rules can compete with each other across the European market. So I happen to have been involved directly in writing one of the SEPA rulebooks many years ago, which was the easier one, the credit transfer rulebook. Credit transfer meaning someone is pushing money out to someone else. Very classically, you type in a payment instruction for another person to receive a payment, which is quite different to a direct debit where you fill in a mandate and give authority to another business to debit your account at a, for example, monthly level. The SEPA rulebooks have been designed in the sort of between 2003 and 2009, and the first basically live transactions happened in 2009 with credit transfers. As you can imagine, a whole jurisdiction as big as this, we have 30 plus countries for euro transactions. It was very hard to come to a compromise as to how the rules should operate, because all of these countries had their domestic payment systems and rules. And it was felt that after having the euro in the market for several years, but not having one system that would harmoniously process those transactions so that users would have the same experience on the receiving and sending side across the market, was something that was missing. And so this was a very big compromise, which took a number of years to design. But it happened, and we designed it on a hopefully more modern standard. We used the ISO 20022 standard in order to design the payment scheme messages, which meant that you could have more data that you can exchange between parties, including also more data that you can exchange on behalf of customers, such as corporates, in terms of sending out invoices. And at the time, we also were seeking for a regulatory framework that would support the rules in terms of the conduct of business, so that every bank in every country that was participating was subject to the same customer to bank or customer to payment service provider set of rules, which was, of course, the Payment Services Directive, which I will discuss a bit later on. This was really a scheme designed for non-urgent transactions. Over the years, it has certainly transformed into a much speedier process. We have launched SEPA instant credit transfers in 2017, similar to the faster payments that were popping up in many other countries. And it's just very interesting to see how many geographies are included in here that are operating on exactly the same type of service level agreement, if you so wish. And then to the international part, I introduced at the beginning. So the SWIFT network, which is owned by the banks, is the biggest global network for interbank messaging. And basically, it allows all those banks to communicate with each other, even if the banks don't have a direct business relationship, because they're all hooked up to the same communication system, which happened to have been executed many years ago via telex, and they can actually all talk to each other. Today, of course, it's all electronic, and there have been a lot of innovations in that network over the last 4 or 5 years that allow for much speedier information and much more granular information detail. But if you look at an international transaction, this can get quite complicated. For example, a payment from Mexico to Germany, you could have a lot more than just 2 banks in the transaction value chain, because some banks may not have the right currency for the transaction. Some banks have not the right amount. There have to be maybe credit lines established between banks. And the SWIFT network allows all of those communications between banks in terms of FX information, payments information, and also the managing of the credit line book entries in the Nostro and Bostro accounts between all the institutions, so that banks can communicate well. In more recent years, there have been some innovations around tracking transactions, and therefore we have actually got the ability now to see between a sending and receiving institution, the institutions participating in that payment journey can actually see where the payment currently is, whether the banks in the value chain have been passing on the transaction, applying their debits and credits, and whether the payment has arrived. In the past, some transactions, as my example between Mexico and Germany, may have taken 7 or 8 days, and no one could understand why these transactions take so much time. Now we have a lot more monitoring in the network, which makes it much harder for certain banks maybe just to be lazy and sit on the money or not pass on messages as they are supposed to. Right. Let's move on to the payments regulatory side. Just to give you an example as to how important and transformative legislation can be, the payment space has been really the space where this has been tested successfully, and I think that is really one of the reasons why we see so much innovation in this space today across so many different countries. In the early days, which was my old days in Brussels, we started with the concept of a new legal framework because we were designing the scheme rules for Single Euro Payments Area, and we realized unless the banks behave in the same way in terms of providing the same type of refund rights to their customers in case a transaction has been wrongly executed, or in terms of providing the same time scale for a transaction between two countries, it shouldn't take 3 or 10 or 8 days between France and Germany to send some euros. It really should only take 3 days in those days and maybe 1 day in the future. We had to create some rules that had to be binding from a legal perspective on all the banks that were part of that framework. And so the new legal framework concept, which we discussed in Brussels from 2003 to 2005, then was renamed as the Payment Services Directive, and ultimately became applicable in the market in 2009. And this was the first set of conduct rules that was mandating how banks have to be operating versus their clients. So at the beginning, when I mentioned the framework contracts that a payment provider has with their customer, is something that was quite clearly defined in the Payment Service Directive in terms of all the information you have to provide for one-off transactions versus a framework contract. But also it defined execution times, T+3 at the time, and then T+1 from 2012. And it, of course, introduced a new type of payment provider to the market. And I think that was the most revolutionary part, because suddenly not only banks, and since 2001 e-money institutions, but also so-called payment institutions were actually entitled to provide payment services. They were not allowed to take deposits, but they could hold on to money for the purpose of a transaction as long as it was a short time frame, and they were allowed to offer credit. They were allowed to offer credit transfers, direct debits, card services. So that new type of category, which had a much lighter regime, much less requirements in terms of any start capital and ongoing capital, was certainly revolutionizing the market. Since then, we had a revision of this law, which came into force in 2017, which was Payment Service Directive 2. And this law further enhanced that aspect of new providers, because since then we had seen that new providers had entered the market, that had started offering services that were not regulated by the Payment Services Directive. And so the Commission wanted to bring those new providers into the fold, and created a specific regime for information and conduct rules for payment institutions that provide payment initiation services, account information services, and third-party payment instrument issuance. And so this whole new context of third parties is something that you're starting to see in many of the open banking initiatives, open banking being a term that was coined in the UK, but really came into Europe. And PSD2 is part of opening up the banking system again further in terms of allowing more competition, because here we can have a third-party provider that is transacting or communicating directly with the consumer or business, and with the bank on the other side, is exchanging information via new technologies, well, allegedly new technologies called APIs or application programming interfaces, and allowing for a lot of functionality on the front end that often the bank cannot provide on the back end. We also, of course, start seeing banks entering these particular services, so there will be potentially a lot more competition coming down the line with this type of new category of third-party provider. So I mentioned the third-party provider. Also, PSD2 enhances further the conduct of business rules in terms of the scope. So in the past, PSD1 was really looking only at the European Union and the member states that were part of the regulatory regime. But here we're also mandating very specific conduct of business rules for transactions that leave the European Union, for transactions to India, to the US, as well as from transactions coming from third parties into the EU. For example, in terms of giving transparency on foreign exchange rates and fees wherever that is possible. It also mandates the use of charges, which initially applied only within the European Union, is now also for the cross-border side. There's a lot of new information to be provided around security. I guess the institutions did realize that as they're opening up the market to third-party providers, that are much more lightly regulated, there could potentially be more risk. So we have a lot of security requirements on all providers in terms of how they're running their security operational procedures, how they're certifying this, but also in terms of the consumer or customer facing side, making sure that every customer performs secure customer authentication for online transactions with two-factor authentication, for example, a PIN and a biometric device or a detail or IP address and things like that. So there's a lot of innovation that could still further continue in that space. The actual rules on secure customer authentication, which have been quite challenging for the card schemes, have been postponed a little bit to the end of this year, but there will be some countries like the UK which has further postponed that into next year. But it's a question of time until everyone adopts and allows for secure authentication in a more frictionless way, because there are quite a lot of concerns that it may trigger too much friction and customers will abandon a transaction. Now, if we look at payment system innovation, I think that is a very interesting piece to just give you some examples. Again, I'm taking the example from the UK because it's much closer to home, but there will be many examples around the world of how payment systems are innovating themselves. And I haven't even spoken about the concept of central bank digital currencies, which is something that we've also included in the course, and it's something that I'm researching personally, and there will be a lot of innovation in that space too. So if we just look at the UK as a little example here, the UK, similar to many other countries, had systems in place for 10, 20, 30 years that have been sort of maintained and upgraded as and when it was needed. But there was quite a big ask to change the way the architecture of those schemes and systems is designed, to make it a lot more open, to make use of the application programming interfaces, the APIs, that allow for much more data flows in a more frictionless way between different institutions, and that would also take care of making life easier for banks and non-bank payment service providers in terms of joining these schemes. I remember in my days at Citigroup, we only joined the back scheme, which is a sort of batch transfer, sort of slightly slow system, only some 6 or 7 years ago, because it was quite hard to do all the system configuration, all the testing. Certain types of technical rules would change over time. So the way that institutions, even if they're large, onboard to these systems was quite clunky, not streamlined, and could have been made a lot easier to handle, as well as the choices between the different systems and how different systems communicate. So the first thing that happened, and that was a sort of year-long strategy work that we set in with the payment systems regulator, which is also an innovative type of regulator in the UK, was to develop a new payment system strategy for the UK market, which was all about making sure that the payment systems and schemes that we have would be brought together and simplified in order to create more interoperability for providers that want to use these systems. So the first part that happened was that faster payments, which was the fast retail, fast system for initially lower value transactions, but increasingly higher value transactions, had to be integrated and consolidated together with the bulk transaction system, as well as the check imaging, into a new operating entity called Pay UK, so that you would have one governance around these schemes and one set of rules on how to access them. And that was step one. The second step, because as part of that, as you can see, the CHAP system, which is the high-value RTGS system, was taken out of the sort of more commercially governed sort of situation that happened before a few years ago, and was brought back into the Bank of England. And the Bank of England decided this system has been running for quite a while. We need to actually refresh it. We need to look at different technology, make it much more future-proof, and think about all the technology innovation that happens in the space of distributed ledger, synchronizing ledgers, real-time APIs, and think about how we're going to innovate to build a new RTGS system. The decision was that both the new payment architecture as well as the new Bank of England RTGS system would operate on a ISO 20022 standard when it comes to the new common credit message. So there would be a unifying factor between these two blocks of systems. There's a lot of investigation and research going on in the Bank of England, not only in the research department, but also in the operational system department, to think about further innovation they could bring into their new RTGS system. For example, atomic settlement that we know quite well from Bitcoin and other type of distributed ledger solutions, as well as maybe synchronizing transactions across different ledgers. For example, when people want to buy a house, to make that a lot more slicker. This new payment architecture in the UK is supposed to come into play together with the new RTGS system from 2022 onwards. It is going to be a very big task for all the providers in the market, because you will have a transition to these new systems. Of course, you cannot operate a faster payment or a BACS if the Bank of England new RTGS system isn't running. So there's a codependency, and it will be a very interesting space to continue to watch. I sat also on the Bank of England's renewal program until I left Citigroup, and it was certainly very exciting, but also very challenging in terms of defining what were the requirements for the UK market and what were the requirements for users, so that the system would deliver a solution that would be future-proof for as long as possible, as opposed to having to be renewed and reviewed in a very short time frame again. We have other examples of payment system innovation. I'm just giving here an example of the Nordics. This is obviously a market across Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland that has a lot of intra-regional trade. And so this project was therefore inspired in terms of making it easier to trade between participants in that block. Some countries in that block, such as Norway, don't have the euro, or Sweden. And therefore, the SEPA initiative wasn't really the answer for that particular geographical block in terms of using just that. So the whole idea was to basically create a common standard across these countries to clear and settle transactions within seconds, regardless of currency. So this is a very interesting concept where we are introducing the notion of multi-currency settlement. I've seen similar initiatives at an RTGS system level in the Gulf region, in terms of how they wanted to create a system that would allow to settle central bank money cross-currency between participating countries. So this is not a very easy task. This is, of course, a commercial clearing system. They launched a legal entity last year. The plan is to start processing transactions later on this year. And it's really all motivated by supporting trade flows across these countries, encouraging e-commerce, which is, of course, a very big piece of focus for everyone, and really reducing the complexity around multi-currency payments in that region. So we will see how that will transpire. I think, again, a very inspiring exercise because of that multi-currency aspect. In SEPA, we only have one currency, which is the euro, but I think this one is certainly interesting from the currency perspective and how the FX is embedded in that. We also, of course, have a good example in Australia, which has been building a new payments platform over the last few years. It's already been operating for some time now. And this has really sort of turned everything around its head, in the sense that they decided to have every transaction, so whether it's a retail small payment or a large corporate transactions, all goes through the same big infrastructure RTGS model. So every transaction is cleared and settled in real time. And that is, of course, the sort of highest security you would want as a bank. The transaction has truly settled. There's a legal framework around it. We've been using central bank money across the central bank system. So it has incredible resilience and security. It is very scalable in the way they designed it, which is very interesting, because that could mean that you may only need one type of payment system in the country as opposed to different types for different types of transactions, as we discussed: retail, instant payments, maybe sort of batch files, which are more used for salary, and then the high value system with the central bank system on the back of it. So it's a very interesting approach to consolidate all in one system. As I mentioned, they have therefore real-time transactions throughout the day. There's no cutoff times, which we usually use to in the operations of payments. Interoperability, they also use the ISO 20022 standard. They have open access for payment service providers, so they also introduce non-bank provider categories that can provide services via overlays. They have enhanced data capabilities, which is of course coming back to the ISO standards they used, and they basically remove settlement risk because it settles directly in the central bank system. They also created some lookup functions with Pay ID, similar to the sort of UK model, where people now are comparing account numbers with names in terms of making sure that transactions go to the right way. And the last innovation that I wanted to give you a bit more detail on was the SWIFT GPI Global Payments Initiative. Again, something that has been launched a few years back. And this was really to finally remedy the challenge that people had for many, many years with cross-border so-called correspondent banking payments. As I said, at a domestic level, you have clearing and settlement mechanisms, but at a global cross-border level, you don't have one global payment system that allows to both clear and settle transactions across different currencies. We don't have a global payment system. So the only thing we have that is as near as possible to this is, of course, the messaging system that SWIFT provides. And if that messaging is not transparent, if there's not enough information to be tapped into by different banks to understand where their transaction currently is, it's very hard to interfere or intervene. And there's a lot of potential credit risk that can build up in that correspondent banking value chain, which is all about debit and credit entries between participants. Because if a large payment gets stuck at a certain bank that doesn't credit it any further, then of course your payment ultimately doesn't arrive. And if as a consequence of that someone goes bust on the other end, then of course you have a trickle-down snowball effect. So the credit risk is present in the correspondent banking world. And in order to tackle that to the extent possible, what is provided here is a lot more transparency on the transaction. So the GPI layer, to which now most of all the banks are actually connected to, provides an ability for a unique transaction, end-to-end transaction reference. So if someone is initiating a payment, it gets that unique UETR, and that unique transaction reference travels through the whole chain down to the beneficiary bank, just like a DHL tracking number, if you so wish. And by virtue of having this number and the ability to check where the number is, because there's a whole cloud system via APIs where banks can check where their transaction currently is, it allows people to potentially intervene or interfere in a transaction that is stuck somewhere. So what has been the result of this is, of course, it has been incredibly speeding up payments, because it turns out that as everyone was now forced to pass on this UETR, they were exposed, right? So some banks may sit on the funds or have their system overhauls and delay sort of passing on transaction messages. And now everyone feels rather compelled to behave. So it was a great opportunity to create a lot more discipline in that infrastructure. And the result of that was that now most of the transactions really are credited within a very short time frame. So certainly more than 90% are being credited within 24 hours. And if we look back at the times not so long ago where some transactions would take 3, 6, or 10 days, that is an amazing achievement. But also more than 60% are credited within 30 minutes. So you can see that the messaging network itself wasn't the challenge. It was the transparency for all providers to see where messages were that were the challenge, and now there's a lot more discipline. The reason why certain transactions take a lot longer are always down to regulatory requirements on reporting. For example, China and some other countries that require specific reporting data to be provided to a regulator before money can be credited in that country, and this is really the exception. But everything else is now being processed very, very quickly. And so that's been a real success in terms of creating discipline in a network that has been running for so many years. And it was such a simple task. There are a lot more services that SWIFT is now going to build based on that. There are inquiry services, there are further KYC and AML check services, and this can continue as now everyone is connected to this platform and has to pass on their transaction reference, but it certainly does deliver a lot of benefit to create something that is almost like a global payment system. So I'll stop here. We've got now more or less 50 minutes for
Thank you very much, Ruth. Excellent. I learned a lot, and I now see why you can speak 5 languages with that work you have to do with SEPA. Probably comes in handy with all that European stuff you're doing.
Good fun,
exactly.
Yeah, for good fun negotiation.
We actually, what we want to do is, what we've done with the other webinars is just to give people a flavour of the exam questions. But while we're doing that, maybe if I see we have got some questions being asked already, but let's, Rox, if we can go to example the exam questions. The exam is set in 2 units. First one is 35 multiple choice questions on the principles of the payment industry. And the first question, I chose one that was more that I could actually answer because it's more to do with compliance stuff. So why would a remitter's payment service provider use sanctions filtering when reviewing a payment instruction? So is it to check no formatting errors, to ensure the remitter's cleared funds, to identify any information that might arouse suspicion, to verify the remitters correctly authorized the payment? So we had over 200. Well, yeah, it's quite easy, but hopefully it's easy. We've had over 200 people join, so that's excellent. So we'll give a couple of seconds more. But I think we can finish that one, Rox. But the answer is C, about the aroused suspicion of terrorist financing, and by the looks of things, most of the people got that right. So there's 2 units, and then the second unit is payment regulation, risk and compliance. There's 25 multiple choice questions, and this question is from this one. And there are also 2 case studies as well. And I know you were talking about SEPA, so that's what I asked that question. So which of the following best describes SEPA? Funds transfer operator, payment trade body based in Europe, remittance transfer provider, single market for Euro-dominated payments within the EU. Okay, so let's get a couple more seconds. And so we actually, Ruth, we had a thing from Gary Collier about the CDCS exam, but I think the learn about the trade side, but actually the same principle for when you're doing any of our exams applies about reading the question clearly, eliminating stuff there that is not obviously correct, and then narrowing down the answers. But the answer for that one is, for what following best describes SEPA. So it's the best, the word there is the best describes, and that is a single market for euro-denominated payments within the EU. So that's answer D. Just want to give you a flavour of how that works. We have had some questions, and I think actually somebody even answered a question. There was somebody asked about what does SWIFT stand for. I don't know if you actually said it. It's one of those words that has become so synonymous, everybody kind of knows what it is, but when you go, what does it stand for? And then somebody actually answered that. So that was good. So in terms of the questions, the first one there, I've heard that SWIFT Category 7 will change at the end of the year. Is this something? Is this too technical that we maybe have to look it up later? Well, it sounds very technical. We're also fielding the MT 202.103 be amended, or will it be a new MT be created?
So maybe a high-level comment is that Swift will move all its messages to ISO 20022 in the next few years, and so the MT stuff will go away altogether. In terms of what happens at the end of this year, I'm not sure whether they actually are postponing the freeze over and some of the changes because of the crisis. So that's something I can definitely check with Swift, and we can come back to that question via email, via write-up.
Oh,
I think, Alex, you're on mute.
am I? Am I? Can you hear me now?
Oh.
Yeah, okay, sorry, I think I know what the problem was.
You, yeah.
My paper was over. So Harry Rantanen from SEB, and he's asking how you see the interactive SCA challenge APIs for large corporate customers used to automate it, but still secure banking connectivity without interactive authentication, but using secured PKI structures. Does that make sense to you?
Right, Harry, maybe we should take this offline. I think, I mean, as you know, the secure customer authentication for online transactions, it really depends on how we define what is online. The idea is, of course, not to create a lot more friction for corporates. And if it's secure and, PKI based, obviously, that is a great example. I think it's about how that is being justified. Most of the SCA conversations are really still in the sort of e-commerce based card transactions, but that is a good question that I can take back in terms of also understanding how some of the third parties are thinking about this as they are serving business customers. So I will take that away. But it is.
So you do know Harry, because I met him for the first time in February, and
nice thing about this webinar, you actually
and then you get your friends asking you tricky questions. There's one from Stephanie. Exactly, if banks are using SWIFT to settle, is there still a CSM used for clearing, or is it direct clearing between participating banks?
So that's an interesting question. So the settlement actually, SWIFT has nothing to do with settlement. SWIFT is allowing the banks to communicate their obligations with each other in terms of the nostro-vostro debits and credits. And sometimes a SWIFT, so it's the information flow, which is a form of clearing, if you so wish. There could sometimes be a transaction that arrives, for example, at a Barclays in the UK, but the ultimate destination is a smaller bank in the UK, and in that instance, Barclays would send a domestic credit transfer via faster payments, for example, to that final beneficiary bank that would then credit its customer. So you could have the use of a clearing and settlement or clearing mechanism. I mean, settlement happens, as I said, at the Bank of England in terms of faster payments 3 times a day. So you could have that last leg that ultimately uses a domestic infrastructure for clearing and settlement, but everything in between is just information messaging between banks to define where the obligation is moving.
An interesting point made, because we are looking at this on this webinar as a broad overview of our qualification and the various parts that are in that. So somebody's asked about the different payment methods discussed today, because you were giving a broad overview. You haven't gone to everything, because that would take weeks. But being asked by different payment methods discussed today, would it be confusion for countries from different regions of the globe? So, because even though you're from a different country, you would still be using some of these payment methods because you're interacting with those countries, aren't you?
Yeah, I think maybe the simplest way to put is there are credit transfers where people push out money. There can be direct debits where people give authority to a third party to debit them. There can be check transactions, physical checks or checks that can be cleared via imaging. And then, of course, there are card transactions, which I didn't go into detail because these tend to be very retail focused or obviously corporate cards. So my focus was more on the payment system side, which is how are transactions between banks processed in terms of those flows. Card schemes operate separately to that, and it's going to be probably an enhancement, well, it will be an enhancement to the course in its next iteration as we start seeing the global card schemes expanding their set of capabilities and going into the account-to-account payment world. Everything today in a card scheme is obviously between the card holders and the issuing and acquiring bank. But as we start to see that account-to-account transactions with open banking are becoming more relevant because they're more efficient, potentially easier to apply, card schemes are also obviously working on enhancing their capabilities there.
There's another question on the SHA codes for charges. Understanding the charges for payment routing are shared between the remitter and receiver of payment. If correspondents are involved for payment routing on both sides, how are charges shared?
Yeah, that's a good question. Within Europe, it's much easier because within Europe we have both the mandate for SHA, so for shared transactions, but also we have a rule that says you cannot deduct from the full amount. So that the example would be that a customer has a relationship with their bank. They may have an agreed fee per transaction. And when the transaction leaves the customer's bank, it is the full amount. So the customer wants to pay £100 to someone else. The £100 leave the bank and also arrive at the beneficiary side, and any charges that are between the bank and its customers are agreed separately on both sides so that the full amount is not touched, which is very important, of course, when we think about trade. Now, at a global level in the correspondent banking world, things are not so clean, and that's exactly why many people are still using our charges mostly. Our charges means that the sender will pay all fees so that the amount of the transaction remains untouched. So again, if you send £100 around the globe to a supplier for a payment, you want to make sure as a sending business that the supplier really receives that full amount, because that's an obligation as per the invoice. And any charges tend to then come back to the sending party that are even applied later on, because some banks may invoice down the chain. And we have on the other side, we have the beneficiary charge, where a sending customer could say, okay, I want the receiving beneficiary pay all the charges. So the £100 would leave the sender, but the receiver may only receive £85 because banks have been taking off their fees. If we use the SHA principle in the correspondent banking world, we would have a situation where, yes, the sender pays part of that, pays their charge to its own bank, then the full amount leaves, but the receiving party could have also an agreement to either deduct charges or invoice separately their customer, and there could be a sharing of the two, which is maybe impacting the actual amount in the sense that there could be something deducted from the amount. The idea is, of course, that that should still be transparent, but the legal rules for that transparency, if any of that happens, only exist in Europe, which is why most people are using our when it
You
comes
see
to
me lean in a bit more with that one, because I've been impacted by that recently when I've had fees taken off, and I was like, where do the fees come from? So that gave me a bit of an insight there. So the one question here, also Swift, and this is, I think it's quite an interesting one, asking what Swift is a secured mode. Why is this not being developed instead of choosing or creating other options? I suppose, I mean, because we have seen a revolution on the payment side over the past few years. It's an interesting question, but maybe you've got a view on that, Ruth.
Yeah, I'm not entirely clear whether I understand the question in terms of whether, why is anyone developing something else?
Yeah, because I think that, why not just improve that instead of bring new things? But I suppose it's about competition, people wanting to do things differently or better, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, Swift, of course, is a very big network, which over the years has moved quite slowly, has done a lot more innovation in recent years, particularly in response to some of those potential innovation threats. I remember Ripple a few years back said we're going to take over correspondent banking, and this didn't last very long. I think there could be an alternative method for a type of sort of central bank money settlement solution that would truly deliver a form of global payments clearing and settlement system. And I think that would be the holy grail. While Swift, as I said, is only a messaging layer, it still operates on the basis of credit risk that happens between the institutions in the chain. And of course, the fact that we have still quite a lot of correspondence in a transaction chain means it's quite inefficient because everyone takes a fee. And we are now in a world inspired by Bitcoin to an extent where we could do peer-to-peer transactions. So I think the question is, could we create something that allows for peer-to-peer with a secure, true settlement mode without needing the central banks to agree it amongst themselves, because that will take forever. And I think there are some initiatives out there, for example, RTGS Global, which are certainly going down that track.
Thanks so much. We've got a minute, so I'll just round up. But what's interesting, somebody's written a comment there about the COVID-19 has had some positive impact on our lives, and one of them being these free webinars. Thanks a lot. So that's a nice way to sort of end the. But the thing is, it's a new way of delivering things. But even if we're not stuck at home, I still think it's a good way to get out to speak to people. And it also provides ability for people to get the CPD points, which they're not able to get in sort of some of the training that they would have been available. Thanks very much, Ruth. Thanks very much for an early start in a weekday morning. Thanks to everybody for joining us. And thanks to Annabelle and Rox for all their support over the past few weeks. And we'll be in touch soon with the webinar recording. But everybody have a good day.